Everything began on the night the desert wind forgot to move, and the sky above Route 89 turned so clear and still, it felt less like a ceiling and more like an open wound in the fabric of reality, bleeding starlight onto the sleeping town of Dry Creek, where a man named Luke Carter worked alone in a dimly lit mechanic shop at the edge of the highway, wondering when exactly his life had become nothing but oil stains, late invoices, and the soft, constant ache of a house that no longer echoed with anyone else's footsteps. Luke was 48 years old, a small-town American mechanic with calloused hands and tired eyes, the sort of man most people barely noticed when they stopped for gas or a tire patch. But heaven has always had a quiet habit of choosing the overlooked, and on this particular night, with Christmas 2 weeks away and the desert dropping into its sharp winter cold, the universe had decided to knock on Luke's rusted metal door using a hand that was not entirely human. He sat on a cracked plastic chair in the corner of the shop, listening to the ticking of a cooling engine and the buzz of a lonely fluorescent tube that flickered like it was fighting off the dark 1 second at a time. And he thought about the life he'd had before the accident on Highway 17, took his wife and unborn child 3 years earlier, before grief hollowed him out and left him moving through his days like a ghost trapped in his own story. He had once believed things, once knelt at the small, white church on the hill with a conviction that Jesus saw him, that God had a plan, that heaven watched over people like him out here in the forgotten stretches of America. But that faith had slipped away drip by drip in the silence of an empty bedroom and the cold side of the bed that never warmed again. Now he believed mostly in torque specs and brake fluid, in engines that either turned over or did not, and in the way work kept his hands busy enough that his mind did not always have to feel. The radio on the wall crackled with a late-night preacher talking about signs in the heavens, about wars and rumors of wars, about trumpets and the last days, and Luke half listened, half ignored him like usual, until the preacher's voice cut out abruptly in a burst of static, and then the whole shop fell into a silence so complete it felt wrong, like the world had blinked out and forgotten to start back up again. In that silence, something shifted in the air, a vibration so subtle that if Luke had not spent his life listening to the almost imperceptible sounds of failing bearings and misaligned belts, he might have missed it entirely. It was as if the night itself had taken a long, slow breath and was now holding it, waiting, listening. Beyond the open bay door, the desert spread out in all directions, a black ocean of sand and scrub, lit only by the thin white spine of the Milky Way and the pale smear of distant towns over the horizon, and Luke found his gaze drawn upward, away from the familiar shapes of his tools and workbenches, toward a patch of sky hanging just above the low hills. Like every trucker and farmer and mechanic who had spent enough time under open skies, Luke knew the constellations by feel, the Hunter to the east, the Dipper to the north, the crooked river of faint stars winding between them. But tonight there was something new, a star that had no right to be where it was, brighter than anything else in the sky, sitting low and solitary above the desert, like some patient eye quietly studying the sleeping earth. It was not a plane, not a satellite, not anything that moved or blinked according to the rules he knew. It simply burned there with a steady, impossible calm, and as he watched, a strange warmth began to push back against the cold in his chest, like someone had lit a candle behind his heart. If you are listening to this story alone somewhere, maybe in a parked truck on a dark highway, or in a small room where the only light is the glow of your phone screen, the narrator might quietly invite you to do something simple right now, to breathe in slowly and ask yourself if you too have ever felt watched over, even on the nights you swore heaven was empty. To leave a trace of yourself, a word, a city, a state, in the invisible space where stories like this gather souls from every corner of the map. Because this is not just Luke's story. It brushes against places in everyone who has ever looked up at the sky and wondered if the stars were not only burning but remembering at 2:13 a.m. Long after most of Dry Creek had gone dark, Luke heard the crunch of tires on gravel outside the shop. 2 vehicles, heavy ones, pulling in fast but controlled. The first was an aging white pickup he recognized as belonging to Sheriff Daniels. The second, a dark, unmarked van that did not belong in a town like this at all. Its windows were blacked out, its plates were government, and the engine ticked with a faint high-tech hum that did not sound like any V8 Luke had ever tuned the shop door. Banged once as the sheriff came in from the cold, bringing with him a gust of desert air tinged with dust and something else, something metallic and sharp, like the aftermath of a lightning strike. The van's rear doors opened with a soft hydraulic hiss, and Luke glimpsed something inside a narrow table. Bright lights, shapes beneath a heavy thermal blanket. The sheriff's face was pale, 10 years older than when Luke had seen him that afternoon, and his eyes did not quite meet Luke's as he said they needed a place off the record, a clean surface, tools, discretion. Luke was not a surgeon, but he had done field repairs on men and machines in his younger days, in deserts far from this one, under skies that burned with foreign constellations. He had stitched wounds, set broken bones, improvised with what he had. He understood why Daniels thought of him. Now, he also understood that something was very wrong. When they wheeled the patient into the center of the shop and pulled back the blanket, Luke's life split cleanly into a before and an after. The figure on his work table was humanoid, but only in the most generous definition of the word. It was smaller than a grown man, long-limbed and lean, with skin the pale grey of early dawn. Its chest rose and fell with shallow, precise breaths, as if breathing was not a reflex, but a decided action. The head was slightly larger than normal, the skull smooth, the features fine and utterly still, but the eyes, when they fluttered open under the harsh shop. Lights were unlike any eyes Luke had ever seen. They were large, almond-shaped, and layered with faint bands of color that seemed to move on their own, deep blues and golds, swirling slowly, like the inside of those glass marbles he had played with as a child. There was intelligence there, ancient and patient and frighteningly clear, and when those eyes met his, Luke felt as if someone had opened a door inside his mind and walked right through without knocking. The sheriff's words moved around him, like background noise, talk of a crash in the desert, of men in suits and missing paperwork, and how Luke had never seen them tonight and would never say a word. But all of that faded when the being on the table reached out without raising a hand, without moving a muscle, and touched Luke in a place no scalpel could ever reach. The contact came as a wave, not of sound or light, but of pure knowing. It was like a memory dropping into his mind that did not belong to him. He saw sand, but not the coarse scrub of the Arizona desert, rather a vast golden ocean under a sky bluer than any he had known. He saw 3 great shapes rising from the earth, not yet finished, their sides swarming with figures, human and not, working in a harmony of color and sound and energy. He saw stones sliding into place as easily as boats on water, guided not by ropes or brute force, but by tones that vibrated the rock itself, lifting it as if gravity had remembered for a moment that it was optional. He saw the Nile, shining like a ribbon of polished copper, and beyond it, a city of white walls and open courtyards where people raised their hands not to unseen rulers, but to the sky, to a light they called by many names. Luke did not know these places, yet they unfolded in his mind with the crispness of his own childhood memories, riding in the back of his father's pickup through wheat fields at dusk. This should not be real, should not be possible, yet his hands, those stubborn, grease-stained, rational hands, that believed only in bolts and wrenches, were trembling above a sternum that was not entirely human, while his heart hammered out a terrified reverence he had not felt since he was a teenager, kneeling at a revival altar. The being on the table did not speak, but its awareness wrapped around Luke's like a warm bandage around a bleeding wound. He understood then that this was an in-between thing, neither entirely alien nor entirely human, a hybrid, shaped in laboratories and wombs he could not. Imagine carrying 2 histories braided together in flesh. The instruments the men in the van had brought were advanced, humming with energies that made the hair along Luke's arms stand up, but it was his hands they needed, hands that knew how to work in cramped spaces, how to improvise, how to stay steady when lives hung in the balance. A shard of something sharp and unseen was lodged near the hybrid's lung, interfering with its strange, meticulous breathing. If it was not removed, the being would die before Luke could protest that he was not qualified. The hybrid's consciousness pressed closer, and suddenly his mind was flooded with images not of stone and desert this time, but of cells dividing, of DNA strands looping and forming words in a language of light. It showed him its own body from the inside, each vessel and organ labeled not with names, but with feelings, with precise intuitions of what would happen if this or that part were cut or spared. He saw the procedure in his mind as clearly as if it were a tutorial video projected onto the walls of his skull. Every movement, every cut, every angle of his hands. It was as though the being were saying, "You are not alone in this. I will guide you. We will do it together. And beneath that clinical, impossible level of detail was something else, a quiet, profound compassion, an understanding of Luke so intimate it made him want to flinch away. It saw him, the way he carried his grief like an old injury, the way he still whispered his wife's name into his pillow some nights when the house creaked just so, the way he had walked away from the faith that had once held him, because he could not reconcile a loving God with twisted metal and flashing lights on a highway shoulder miles from help. The hybrid knew all of this and did not recoil, did not judge. It simply held him in its awareness as if to say, all of that is part of why you are here now. If you have ever lost someone and felt your faith crack under the weight of that empty chair at the table, the narrator might gently suggest that this is the moment in Luke's story where your paths quietly intersect, for those listening who know the feel of a wrench in their hand or the hum of tires on asphalt at 3 a.m. Say for those who carry questions about God they no longer dare to voice out loud, this is where the story leans in close and asks you to stay, to keep watching, to hear what was about to be revealed to one small-town mechanic under the indifferent glare of a fluorescent bulb. His tools were laid out on the metal tray like a poor man's surgical kit. Screwdrivers, pliers, a small rotary cutter he used for delicate work on stubborn bolts. The men in suits had provided sterile gloves and a mask and a few sleek instruments whose purpose he only half understood, their surfaces smooth and dark, absorbing light instead of reflecting it. He moved on instinct, and on the memory the hybrid had pressed into him, hands hovering for a moment above the narrow chest before settling on the first incision. The skin yielded like soft rubber beneath his blade, and beneath it the muscles glistened not red, but a faint pearlescent grey, flexing in patterns that did not match human anatomy, yet somehow made sense. In the new overlay of understanding that had been grafted onto his perceptions, as he worked, the hybrid's awareness held his steady like a pair of invisible hands, guiding his wrists whenever doubt made them falter. At certain points, images surged up with particular clarity. A tall figure robed in white standing on a ridge of sand, watching the first blocks of a pyramid slide into place. Not commanding, not ruling, but witnessing, recording, a sense of having seen ages rise and fall, of remembering. When stars occupied different positions in the sky, when languages were sung rather than spoken, the hybrid was not merely recalling the construction of the pyramids as a fact from a history book. It was remembering it as something it had stood inside of as a living moment, as someone who had been there among those who hummed the stones into the air with resonant tones that matched the hidden music of the earth. Luke tried to shut it out, tried to focus only on tissue and instruments, but the more closely he followed the anatomical guidance the hybrid offered, the deeper those other memories pressed into him, until he could feel the dry heat of that ancient sun on his own skin, could see the glint of light off copper tools, could hear a language that was not English and not any tongue he recognized, rising in a chorus that made the air itself vibrate. The vision widened. At the center of that desert city stood not just monuments, but a convergence point, a place where sky and earth seemed to fold toward each other, where people came carrying questions not about crops and taxes, but about eternity, about the purpose of suffering, about whether the light that warmed their faces during the day continued somewhere after their bodies turned to dust. The hybrid understood those questions because its kind had been there not as conquerors or gods, but as watchers and teachers, nudging a young humanity toward certain alignments, toward the construction of shapes that would endure long after. Languages crumbled, shapes tuned to frequencies that spoke a silent sermon to the universe about what kind of beings these earth children wished to become. Luke's blade reached the fragment lodged near an organ that was not quite a lung and not quite anything in human medicine books. It pulsed faintly, a sliver of something dark and wrong that seemed to flicker at the edges like a glitch in reality itself. As he gripped it carefully with forceps, the hybrid's awareness intensified, and, for the first time, he felt not mere guidance but vulnerability. It was afraid, not of death exactly, but of failing in something it had come to do, of leaving a message undelivered. He removed the shard in a smooth, decisive motion, and as it left the hybrid's body, a jolt shot through the air like a static discharge, but deeper, stranger. Every fluorescent light in the shop flared, then dimmed. The radio flicked on for half a second, spitting out a fragment of a hymn he remembered from childhood about amazing grace and lost men being found before falling silent again. The hybrid's chest rose deeper now, more rhythm in the movement, and for a moment the air was full of a bright, almost unbearable clarity. Luke felt like a lens suddenly brought into perfect focus. The hybrid poured understanding into him, no longer in scattered images but in a coherent stream. It showed him how humanity had always been accompanied by watchers, beings tasked not with control, but with witness and occasional intervention when the story tilted too far toward self-destruction. It showed him that the pyramids were not alien constructions in the way conspiracy theorists imagined, but collaborations, partnerships between human longing and cosmic knowledge, temples not to the beings themselves, but to the idea that heaven and earth were not so far apart as they seemed. It showed him a slender thread running from that desert city, straight through Bethlehem, through a stable, where animals breathed softly in the cold and a young woman clutched a newborn she did not fully understand, through Galilean hills, where a man spoke of a kingdom not built with hands, through a wooden cross silhouetted against a darkened sky, through empty tomb and tongues of fire, and centuries of saints and sinners stumbling toward the same light. And then it did something that undid Luke more completely than any scalpel cut could have. It placed him on that thread too. It let him see his own grief, his own anger at God, his own years of silent cursing and half-formed prayers as part of that same long, halting story. The night his wife died, the scream he had swallowed, the cross he had ripped from his rearview mirror and thrown into a ditch. These were not proofs of abandonment, but verses in a psalm of a man who had not yet heard the last line. The hybrid did not tell him that everything would be all right or that the accident had been part of a plan in any trite way. Instead, it let him feel, if only for a heartbeat, the perspective of a consciousness that remembered not just the building of stone monuments, but the arcs of billions of lives across thousands of years. He saw that pain was not the opposite of love, but its cost in a broken world. That loss did not erase connection, that somewhere beyond his current horizon, his wife still existed not as a vague ghost, but as a person whose journey continued in ways his mind was not yet wired to perceive. The being showed him that the one called Jesus, whose name still tasted like dust and longing on Luke's tongue, was more than a figure in stained glass, more than a doctrine used to divide pews. It showed him that in some incomprehensible way, the carpenter from Nazareth was the axis on which all these stories turned, the point where Creator stepped fully into creation to feel everything from the inside, to bleed, to grieve, to die, to rise, and in doing so to stitch heaven and earth together with a thread that could never again be fully cut. And then, with a gentleness that made his throat burn, the hybrid let him feel that presence here in this dingy mechanic shop, hovering in the smell of oil and antiseptic, in the rasp of his own breath through the mask, in the thudding beat of the hybrid's newly freed heart. It was as if, for one fragile moment, the walls between worlds thinned and Luke stood not alone between a sheriff, some suits, and a patient who should not exist, but in a sanctuary built of steel and dust, where a different kind of surgery was taking place on his own soul. He finished closing the incision with hands that no longer shook. The hybrid's chest rose and fell with steady, measured breaths, its strange eyes half closed, but the awareness between them did not fade. Instead, it softened, settled into a quiet hum in the back of his mind, like a song he could not quite hear, but somehow knew the words to. The men in suits moved in quickly then, reclaiming the patient with practiced efficiency, bundling it back into their van with oxygen lines and monitoring equipment. Luke wanted to ask 1,000 questions, to demand answers about where it had come from, about why it had shown him what it did, about what it meant that something which remembered the construction of the pyramids now lay alive because of his clumsy human hands. But the sheriff's warning look and the cold, flat politeness of the agents held his questions behind his teeth. They left as quickly as they had come, tires crunching back out onto the gravel, tail lights vanishing into the desert night, and then Luke was alone again in the shop, the only evidence of what had transpired a faint metallic smell and a tray of bloodied, otherworldly instruments that were already being loaded into the back of the van in his memory more than in reality. Outside, the mysterious star that had burned so steadily low on the horizon was gone, or perhaps it had never been a star at all, but an opening, a point of convergence, a reminder. He stood in the center of the oil-stained concrete, gloved hands hanging uselessly at his sides, And for the first time in 3 years, he did not feel nothing. He felt everything, too much. He felt the weight of his own smallness and the staggering scope of the story he had been briefly allowed to glimpse. He felt awe and anger, and a strange fragile hope fluttering in his chest like a bird testing broken wings. He wondered if he was losing his mind, if grief and loneliness and too many long nights had finally tipped him into hallucination. He wondered if maybe he had fallen asleep in his chair and dreamed the whole thing, if any second now he would wake up to the same old world where the only mysteries were why an alternator failed or a transmission slipped. But when he stripped off his gloves, his hands were trembling, and there was a fine dust on his skin, a shimmer like crushed pearl that caught the light of the flickering bulb and refused to be wiped away. And somewhere deep in his mind, where no trauma or denial could reach, a quiet alien voice that felt older than empires and yet as gentle as a prayer was still whispering about stone and stars and a carpenter who was more than a man. Luke shut off the lights and stepped out into the desert night. The wind had started again, moving across the sand with a low hiss, as if the earth itself were exhaling after holding its breath for too long. The sky looked almost normal now, a scatter of stars, the faint band of the Milky Way, a distant plane blinking, red as it tracked its way toward a city far from here. But Luke knew better. Normal had been an illusion made of habit and numbness, and that illusion had been cut open tonight on his work table, revealing something raw and luminous beneath. He locked the shop door not to keep anything out, but to keep himself contained for just a few hours more, and walked the short distance to his small house, every step echoing with a new and terrible awareness. The hybrid had survived. The operation was over. The world officially had not changed, but inside him something had been set in motion that would not be easily stopped. The memory of ancient sand and rising stone would not leave him. The sense of being seen down to the marrow by a consciousness that spanned millennia would not quiet. And the question, the one he had buried under years of anger and silence, returned with a force that made his knees almost buckle on the gravel. Who are you, really, Jesus? And why do beings who remember the pyramids still speak your name in the language of light? He did not have an answer. Not yet. He only had a feeling that the story he had been told as a child about a God who stepped into human history was not a fairy tale for the frightened and naive, but a fragment of a much bigger, stranger, more beautiful truth than any of his Sunday school teachers had dared to imagine. And that truth was now stalking him through his own life, like a quiet, relentless shadow, waiting for the moment he would finally turn around and face it. In the days that followed, Luke moved through his life as if someone had taken his ordinary world and turned the contrast all the way up, so that every edge was too sharp, every silence too loud, every routine moment haunted by the knowledge that somewhere out there was a being who remembered sunlight on ancient stone, and the rise of structures humans would one day call wonders of the world, a being who now carried a small scar beneath its strange ribcage because a mechanic in a forgotten town had reached into impossible flesh and pulled death away by following instructions printed not on paper, but across the inside of his mind. He woke before dawn most mornings, not to an alarm, but to a sensation like a soft electrical current in his chest, a hum that rose and fell with his breathing, sometimes resolving into the faintest impression of words that were not quite words, a language of feeling that was more like music than speech. Sometimes, in those dim moments between sleep and waking, he would see again the golden desert and the half-finished pyramids, their angled silhouettes cutting into a sky so blue it hurt, and he would feel the presence of the hybrid nearby, not as a patient this time, but as a companion, watching with him from within his own thoughts, offering no commentary, simply standing quietly beside him in memory, as if to remind him that what he had seen was not a glitch or a dream. It was real. The first weeks he tried to argue with himself, tried to push the images down under layers of rational explanations. Stress, lack of sleep, unresolved grief, maybe even some undiagnosed post-traumatic echo from his years overseas. He told himself that the government had probably taken the hybrid to some underground facility where scientists in white coats were now reducing the mystery to blood panels and scans, where whatever strange connection he had felt during the operation would be explained by chemicals and suggestibility, but his body would not cooperate with this neat retreat into skepticism. His hands, which had always ached in the mornings from old injuries, no longer hurt his back, which usually complained after a long day bent over engines, moved with a new, unsettling ease. Food tasted sharper, richer. The sky seemed layered, as if behind the blue there was another color trying to bleed through, and every time he walked past the small white church on the hill, where he had once knelt and later refused to return, something tugged at him with quiet insistence, not the old guilt-based pressure of obligation, but a gentle gravity, like a familiar hand at the small of his back, guiding him toward a doorway he had sworn never to cross again. He lasted 12 days before that pull became too strong to ignore. On a Sunday morning cold enough to frost the edges of his shop windows, he found himself driving past the church more slowly than usual. The parking lot was half full, the cars coated with a thin layer of dust and salt from the highway. The bell was ringing, not loudly but steadily, the sound drifting down over the town in soft waves. He parked at the far edge of the lot, where no one was likely to notice if he changed his mind and left, and sat behind the wheel, fingers drumming against the steering wheel, while his heart threw itself against his ribs like a trapped thing. For 3 years he had stayed away from this place, had driven the long way around town to avoid seeing the building that in his darkest hours had come to represent not comfort, but betrayal. How could a god these people sang to have watched a drunk driver cross a yellow line and taken everything from him in a flash of headlights and twisting metal? He had not wanted their casseroles or their sympathy, or their soft, well-meaning assurances that his wife was in a better place. He had wanted her here, warm and alive and laughing in their kitchen. He had wanted a god who intervened in steel and glass the way he supposedly intervened in hearts. And when he did not show up on that asphalt, Luke had quietly closed the door on him now. Sitting under the pale winter sun, he realized that door had not locked the way he thought it had. The presence he had felt in the shop during the operation, the way the hybrid's memories had braided through stories of a baby in Bethlehem and a man on a cross, had cracked something in his certainty that he understood what faith was and what it was not, if beings who had watched pyramids rise still turned there. Awareness toward that carpenter from Nazareth with a kind of reverence, if their language of light still bent itself around the name Jesus with the soft inevitability of a river finding its bed, then perhaps Luke had not walked away from a childish superstition after all. Perhaps he had simply walked away too soon, before the next chapter had been read. He got out of the truck before he could talk himself out of it, and walked toward the church door, hands in his jacket pockets, shoulders hunched. Against more than just the cold inside, the space was almost painfully familiar. Rows of wooden pews, scuffed in the same places his boots had once marked. The faint, lingering scent of coffee and old hymnals, the cross above the altar, simple and unadorned, catching the light from the narrow stained glass windows that painted muted colors on the walls. The congregation was mid-song when he slipped into the back row, their voices low but earnest, words about grace and mercy and an open door waiting. For prodigals he did not sing, he did not kneel when they knelt. He stood there feeling both out of place and exactly where he was supposed to be. His eyes wandered to the stained glass depiction of the Nativity on the side wall. The artist had rendered Bethlehem as a gentle hilltop village, the stable tidy and warm, the star above it a tasteful golden flare. He thought about the hybrid's memories of a much harsher world, of real dust and sweat and fear and hope hanging in the air like incense. He felt a sudden surge of almost painful clarity. The child in that window was not a symbol, not an icon, not a moral lesson. He was a point of contact, a place where the creator of all the galaxies the hybrid had seen had chosen to become small, breakable, subject to gravity and infection, and the reckless decisions of men behind the wheel of fast cars and slow consciences. The service blurred at the edges as Luke drifted in and out of his own thoughts. The sermon was about doubt and faith, and the disciple Thomas who had needed to see wounds before he could trust resurrection. The pastor spoke of how Jesus had not shamed Thomas for that need, but had offered his hands and side freely, meeting doubt not with condemnation, but with tangible evidence of love. Luke listened, and part of him laughed dryly inside, thinking that if that pastor knew what kind of evidence had been offered to him in a mechanic's shop at 2 a.m., oh, he would not know whether to call an altar call or the Pentagon afterward. People milled around shaking hands, catching up on small-town gossip, their lives comfortably contained within the boundaries of jobs and families and local concerns. A few recognized Luke, offered guarded, kind greetings, like someone welcoming back a man who had left a party years ago without saying goodbye. He answered politely, but his mind was elsewhere. The hybrid was quiet that morning, a distant hum at the back of his awareness, as if giving him room to decide whether he would step toward the old faith in a new way or recoil in fear of disappointment. He drove home along the long road that cut between fields, lying fallow under a sheen of frost, the church slowly shrinking in his rearview mirror, yet somehow larger in his thoughts than it had ever been. The first miracle did not look like a miracle at all, at least not in the flashy cinematic way that word tends to suggest. It happened 3 days later, in the least spiritual place Luke could imagine, lying on his back in the grit under a jack-raised pickup, cursing at a rusted bolt that refused to budge. His shoulder ached the way it always had since shrapnel had lodged there abroad, deep near the joint where doctors had decided it would cause more damage to extract than to leave. And like every other day for years, he worked around the pain, wincing through certain angles, accepting the sharp protests in his nerves as part of the cost of being alive and still functional. He slipped, the wrench snapped his hand sideways, and a white-hot spike of pain shot up his arm into that old wound. In reflex more than in prayer, he thought help, not sure who he was addressing, the God he had half returned to on Sunday, the hybrid who had once guided his hands, or some undefined third option that lived in the overlap between the two. There was a pause, as if the universe considered the request, and then, like warm water spilling into frozen pipes, something loosened in his shoulder. A spreading heat moved through the scarred tissue, not burning but soft and insistent. The ache he had carried for so long that it had become part of how he measured his own body drained away, leaving a sensation so alien in its absence that he lay there for a moment in stunned stillness, moving his arm experimentally. No grinding, no stabbing protest, no familiar catch. The bolt that had resisted him turned easily under his fingers a second later, as if it, too, had surrendered to whatever had shifted. The hybrid's presence brushed against his awareness then, closer than it had been since the operation, and in that touch was no boast, no suggestion of "see what I can do." Instead, there was almost a deflection, a gesture upward and outward, as if to say, "This is not my power. I only reminded your body of what it remembered before. Fear and injury and time convinced it to hold on to hurt." He sat up slowly, back against the tire, staring at his own arm like it belonged to someone else. He had heard testimonies like this once, years ago, people in church talking about sudden healings, about pain vanishing under the weight of hands and prayer. He had believed them, or thought he did, until life and highway wreckage had trained him to distrust any story that wrapped itself too cleanly. More often than not, in his experience, wounds festered, scars tightened, and chronic aches accumulated until they became the background noise of existence. But now, with road, dust on his clothes and grease on his palms, he could not deny that something beyond physical therapy or positive thinking had rewritten the code of his flesh. He flexed his fingers, rolled his shoulder, laughed once in disbelief that sounded more like a sob, and in that moment he stopped trying to decide whether what had happened in the shop was a spiritual experience wearing an alien mask or an alien encounter dressed in old religious clothes. He started to consider, seriously and without the automatic flinch of his old defenses, that maybe the division between those categories was part of the illusion the hybrid had tried to peel away. The weeks stretched into months, and the world outside Dry Creek grew stranger by headlines. Small, hard-to-explain events began popping up in news reports that played between weather and sports. A pilot describing an object that moved in ways no known craft could move on. An archaeologist quietly publishing scans of a chamber deep beneath one of the Giza. Pyramids that should not be there according to existing maps, its walls humming with residual electromagnetic traces that puzzled every instrument, move on a child in another state, waking from a coma, speaking in a language no one in their family had ever learned, a language that scholars later identified as an archaic dialect. No living community currently used. Most people shrugged, made jokes, scrolled past between shifts. Luke found himself digging deeper, late nights lit by the cold glow of a computer screen, connecting threads he never would have noticed before. The hybrid was not feeding him information. It did not overwhelm his free will or commandeer his curiosity. It simply nudged here and there, a quiet pressure when he lingered over one article instead of another, a flicker of increased awareness when an obscure documentary about sacred geometry auto-played after a truck repair video. He began to see patterns not of conspiracy in the paranoid sense, but of convergence, as if separate streams of human inquiry were all beginning to curve toward the same ocean. The pyramids, once just distant wonders to him, became almost painfully significant. He would stare at photographs of their worn steps and straight edges, at the way their sides caught dawn and dusk, at the way they anchored themselves in the desert like thoughts so heavy the earth itself had bent around them. And every time, that old memory, not his but grafted into him, would stir. He would smell the mix of sweat and incense, hear the layered tones of voices singing the blocks into place, feel the hybrid's perspective beside his, watching not as a master architect, but as a guardian of intention. The pyramids had been built as more than tombs or royal propaganda. They were instruments, resonant bodies tuned to the frequencies of the planet and the sky, amplifying certain kinds of human longing, flooding them outward into a cosmos that was listening. Their shapes mirrored constellations, not by accident, but by design, each angle and chamber aligning with the paths of stars that framed a story. Humanity was too young then to read fully. A story not about beings descending in fire to rule, but about a descent of a different kind, quiet and protracted, the way rain sinks into hard ground over time, preparing it for seeds. The hybrid showed him how, centuries after those stones had settled into place, and the city around them had risen and fallen and risen again under different flags and gods, the same watchers who had helped humans tune those monuments had watched another construction project much smaller in terms of mass, but infinitely more significant in meaning, a body forming in the womb of a village girl, a nervous system wiring itself to carry not just the impulses of survival, but the full current of divine consciousness, without shorting out, a heart that would beat out the rhythm of a love so fierce it would step willingly into the machinery of human violence and allow itself to be ground, up so that the gears might finally break. Luke would lie awake some nights with these images and feel his brain protest that this was too much, that he was only a man with wrenches and scars and a mortgage, not a theologian or a physicist or an historian. He would feel fear lick at the edges of his thoughts. What if he was being deceived? What if these shining memories were a sophisticated trick, pulling him away from the simplicity of the gospel he had once known? He wrestled with that suspicion, honestly, because the last thing he wanted was to trade one kind of comforting illusion for another. Yet every time he brought those fears into the small space of prayer he had tentatively reopened, sitting at his kitchen table with his Bible unopened in front of him like a question, he did not feel the cold push of manipulation that trauma recognizes. He felt instead the same presence he had first known as a teenager, kneeling on worn carpet, the same quiet, steady warmth he had sensed even on the nights after the accident when, in his angriest moments, he had shouted profanity into the darkness and then hated himself for directing it at an empty sky. That presence did not argue with the hybrid's memories. It encompassed them, as if saying, "Yes, I was there. Yes, I allowed watchers to stand guard over your early attempts to reach for me. Yes, I stepped into that story in a way that fulfilled symbols you did not yet know you were drawing. And yes, even now, in a mechanic's shop in a dying town, I am still stepping in." The second miracle did not involve his own body, but another man's soul. It came on a hot afternoon in late summer, when the air above the highway shimmered with heat, and the asphalt radiated waves that made distant objects blur. Luke had been called out to the edge of town to tow a stalled sedan, its hood up, steam rising in weak curls. As he pulled up, his stomach lurched. The driver's face in the harsh noon light was older than in the photo he had seen once in a police file, more lined, more slack around the eyes, but the recognition slammed into him with the force of another collision. This was the man who had been behind the wheel 3 years earlier, the man who had crossed the center line, the man whose blood alcohol level had been printed in black numbers on a white report sheet, the man Luke had spent many nights imagining in courtrooms in his mind, delivering speeches he would never actually give about justice and loss and rage, the man he had privately damned in. Words he would not have spoken in front of a cross, even when he claimed not to care about crosses anymore. For a moment, everything inside him locked up. The hybrid's presence flared, not intrusive, but fully attentive, as if recognizing that this was a hinge, a small human moment, on which a vast internal door could swing one way or another. The man did not recognize Luke at first. He was too busy cursing the engine, the heat, his luck, But then, as Luke stepped closer, something in his posture changed. His eyes narrowed, then widened. Their gazes met, and a series of emotions flickered across his face. Denial, confusion, dawning horror, shame. He knew Luke saw it, and in that shared flicker, something fragile hung between them, like a wire stretched over a deep canyon. For a few heartbeats, Luke entertained the old script. He could turn away, refuse service, let the man bake on the roadside. He could lash out, let years of stored venom pour from his mouth. He could demand payment, not in money but in a full accounting of remorse. But beneath those familiar options, another possibility rose, quieter but rooted in that same thread the hybrid had shown him, running from pyramids to Bethlehem to Calvary and beyond. Forgiveness, not as excusing or forgetting, not as pretending the accident did not shatter his world, but as a deliberate choice to unclench his hand around the right to vengeance, to pass that heavy weight into hands more capable of holding it. There was no beam of light, no dramatic score rising in the background, only the roar of passing trucks and the shrill song of insects in the ditch. Yet in that ordinary cacophony, Luke felt the presence of the one who had, in his own execution, spoken words of forgiveness over men who did not even think to ask for it. He understood suddenly, with the clarity of a wrench clicking precisely into place on the right-sized bolt, that this was what all the visions and healings and alien testimonies had been spiraling him toward. Not special knowledge, not mastery of metaphysical secrets, but this brutal, liberating act of opening his hand. He heard himself offer help in a tone that contained no acid. He heard himself say that he remembered the accident and that he had spent a long time hating, but that he was tired of carrying that weight. He watched the other man's shoulders sag as if someone had cut a rope that had been cinched around his ribs for years. There were tears, awkward and unpolished, there on the shoulder of the highway in the glaring sun, two men sweating and weeping between a tow truck and a dead sedan. One confessed, stumbling over words of regret that had had no place to go until now. The other listened and, in a way that surprised him more than any alien memory, found his heart softening not with sentimental amnesia, but with an almost fierce compassion. The hybrid watched from within him, not as a puppeteer, but as a witness, and in its attention, Luke sensed something like awe, as if this act of forgiveness between two small humans carried a weight in the universe equal to the lifting of stones into impossible heights. He towed the car, fixed it, refused extra payment, and when the man drove away, Luke stood for a long time in the cooling air of his shop, feeling that some invisible structure inside him had been rebuilt, stone by stone, on a new foundation. The title of the old doctrine that had once made him eye-rolling and wary now flickered in his thoughts with a new, raw meaning. Rapture. For years he had heard it described in charts and timelines, as bodies vanishing from airplane seats and cars left driverless on highways, as an escape hatch for the faithful from a world going up in flames. But the hybrid and the presence that moved beyond it had been telling him a different version, one not about leaving the earth behind, but about the earth itself, and those still on it, being lifting not in altitude, but in awareness, in capacity to love, in willingness to see. Through the cheap illusions of separateness to the pulsing unity beneath, perhaps there would come a day when lines blurred in ways physics currently scoffs at, when dimensions folded and some would cross a threshold in ways eyes could register, but even then, the real movement would not be measured in feet off the ground. It would be measured in hearts released from gravity's lesser laws by a stronger pull. Luke began to live as if that lifting had already started in him. He did not become a preacher. He did not stand on corners with signs or pass out tracts with small fonts and big warnings. He went on fixing engines and changing oil and balancing tires, but he did it with a strange lightness, as though each car he worked on was less a machine and more a vessel carrying stories and sorrows. He felt a quiet privilege in serving. He listened more than he spoke when customers vented about their lives. He found words of encouragement slipping from his tongue that were not forced or cheesy, but fit the moment like a custom-made part. He started going back to the little church regularly, sitting near the back, absorbing more than participating, yet gradually finding his lips moving with the hymns, not because he felt he had to, but because the words now connected to something he had seen with his own inner eyes. That connection deepened one evening when the pastor, unaware of the galaxies churning behind his mechanic congregants' eyes, spoke about the kingdom of God Jesus had described not as a distant realm accessed only after death, but as a reality near at hand. Within, Luke remembered the hybrid's way of perceiving, of overlaying physical structures with energetic meaning, of seeing pyramids not just as stone, but as frozen prayers he imagined, just for a moment, his own small town overlaid with that same kind of map. Not as a cluster of buildings and zip codes, but as a grid of choices, each interaction a tiny pyramid built or toppled by kindness or cruelty. Felt the hybrid lean in, silently affirming that these small daily constructions mattered as much in the cosmic calculus as anything carved in desert stone millennia. Ago one night, months into this new life, as autumn crept in and the desert began to cool, Luke woke from a dream that was not like the others. This time he was not viewing the pyramids as if through the hybrid's remembering eyes. He was there as himself, yet also not. He stood at the base of the Great Pyramid, its sides newly smoothed, the casing stones still bright, reflecting a sky strewn with unfamiliar patterns of stars. People moved around him, robed and purposeful, some with skin and faces like those in modern photographs of Egypt, others with subtle differences that marked them as other. The hybrid was beside him in fully visible form, taller, its eyes glowing faintly in the torchlight. It lifted a long, delicate hand and rested it against one of the lower stones, and the air thrummed. The sound was not quite audible, more like a pressure in his chest. A chord struck inside the rock itself. Threads of light laced between the pyramid's apex and specific stars overhead, forming a net of luminous lines. Through that net he sensed intention, a collective message sent outward. We remember you. We seek you. We are learning to reflect you. And then the scene shifted with the disorienting jump of a dream. He was no longer in the desert, but standing in a field outside Bethlehem under a black sky ripped open by light. Not from stars, but from a source closer, brighter, singing not in tones of stone, but in tones of joy. Shepherds around him shielded their eyes, their faces a mirror of the awe that beat in his own chest, while voices spoke of peace on earth and goodwill toward men. And in that proclamation, he felt echoes of the earlier message from the pyramids, not identical, but harmonized, as if the long project of teaching humanity to reach upward had finally been met by a descent of unimaginable humility. The hybrid's presence was there too, not in body but in witness, moved by the sight of its long-watched species becoming the stage for something it did not fully comprehend, but revered. Luke felt, with an almost painful clarity in that dream, that all of history was not a random sprawl but a choreography, sometimes clumsy, often resisted, yet guided toward this intersection where the infinite had become an infant. When he woke, tears were already slipping into his hairline, his chest tight, not with grief but with a strange, aching gratitude. The hybrid was right there in his awareness, closer than it had ever been in waking life. And for the first time, Luke did not address it as an experiment or a messenger or even a friend. He simply let his mind turn toward it with unguarded honesty and admitted that he was afraid of being wrong, afraid of being laughed at if he ever spoke any of this aloud, afraid of building his newly tender faith on experiences that could be ripped away, but also afraid of returning to the grey, numb life he had known before, now that color had been shown to him. The hybrid responded not with more visions, but with something that felt very much like a smile in thought form, and then it stepped back, not away, but to the side, making space for another presence to step forward. One he had known long before he knew words like extraterrestrial or hybrid. It was the same quiet pressure he had felt at the altar as a young man, the same whisper that had pursued him through bar nights and lonely drives and the long bitter silence after the crash. This presence did not argue for its own reality. It simply was, and in its being, it carried a question, not a demand or a threat, but an invitation. Would he trust that love had been threading through his story, long before pyramids or planets, long before accidents or surgeries? Would he let that love define him more than the worst thing that had happened to him? The choice did not come with fireworks or shaking foundations. It came with a slow exhale and a wordless internal yes that felt less like conversion and more like coming home. After that night, the hybrid's input into his life lessened, not because it had abandoned him, but because the training wheels had done their work. It remained a faint, steady star on the horizon of his awareness, a reminder that the universe was larger and more populated and more complicated than most Sunday sermons touched on, but it no longer needed to flood his mind with ancient sand and stone to prove anything. The core revelation had taken root. Luke's world did not suddenly become easy. Engines still seized, bills still arrived, conflicts still flared in town meetings and family gatherings. The news continued to broadcast ugliness, wars and greed and disasters that made him feel small and helpless. But beneath all of that, like the bass line under a complex song, he felt a different rhythm. The sense that history was not spiraling downward uncontrollably, but moving toward something, a revealing, an unveiling, a kind of collective operation in which all the lodged shards of violence and fear in the human heart would be exposed and, for those willing, removed. And he knew now, in a way he would never have believed a year earlier, that beings who remembered the construction of the pyramids were watching too, not as invaders with conquest in their eyes, but as elder siblings hoping, with a tenderness that surprised them, that humanity would choose love. Over fear, when the pressure increased, he still dreamed of the hybrid sometimes, its strange calm eyes taking in both stone monuments and fragile human decisions with equal gravity. In one of those dreams, he found himself back in his own shop, watching his younger self lean over the hybrid's body in that first wild night. The scene froze like someone had hit pause on a recording. Then the viewpoint shifted until he was no longer watching from the outside, but looking down along a line that stretched. From the glowing heart of a distant galaxy, through the hybrid, through his own hands, through the very concrete under his boots, and into the molten core of the earth. He understood then, with a simplicity that made all his anxious theological debates seem small, that everything from stars to scalpels, from pyramids to pickup trucks, existed inside one immense, sustaining love, that the story of Jesus of Nazareth the hybrid had honored with such reverence was not a temporary patch applied to a broken system, but the revelation of how that love had always operated, giving itself, refusing to coerce, inviting, always inviting, even when crucified by those it came to save. Perhaps the sky had never truly been above him as an elsewhere to be reached or escaped to. Perhaps it had always been within and around, the light that leaked through whenever people stopped running long enough to feel its warmth and let it guide their hands on bolts and on wounded hearts. Truth or fiction? Perhaps not even. The teller of this story knows for certain. Here, stories like this exist not to provide diagrams of the unseen, but to touch something wordless in you, to tilt your gaze a few degrees toward a possibility you may have almost forgotten. The magic, if there is any, does not show itself to those who dissect every detail seeking only certainties. It sidles up to those who dare, if only for the length of one long desert night or one hard-won forgiveness on the side of a highway, to simply feel the weight of being loved in a universe far stranger and far kinder than they were ever taught to expect.